A teacher bullies a black boy every day, mocking him, tearing him down, convinced he's just another troublemaker. The boy never fights back. But then, the teacher is summoned to the principal's office, and his world shatters. The boy he tormented? He's the principal's son, and now it's too late to undo the damage. Will the student he tried to break be the one who decides his fate? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The late afternoon sun slanted through the classroom windows, casting long shadows across the empty desks. Mr. Wallace sat at his desk, repeatedly checking his watch and shuffling papers that didn't need shuffling. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the silence, each second echoing his growing discomfort. His stomach tightened with an unfamiliar sensation. Was it anxiety? Impossible. He'd been teaching for 17 years. A simple detention session shouldn't affect him this way. 3:29 p.m., 1 minute until their scheduled meeting. Wallace straightened his tie for the third time, his fingers trembling slightly. The detention slip on his desk seemed to mock him, a flimsy piece of paper that had started this whole mess. He'd written hundreds of these slips over his teaching career, but this one felt different. This one carried weight. He ran his finger along its edge, remembering the flash of anger that had prompted him to write it. The sound of measured footsteps in the hallway made him tense. Right on time, Jamal Carter appeared in the doorway. The young man's expression was carefully neutral, his posture straight but relaxed. He carried his books close to his chest like a shield, but there was nothing defensive about his manner. If anything, there was a quiet dignity in how he stood there, waiting. "Come in," Wallace said, his voice sounding too loud in the quiet room. He gestured to the desk directly in front of him, the one he'd positioned there specifically for this detention. "Right here, please." Jamal walked in with deliberate steps, neither hurrying nor dawdling. He placed his books on the desk and sat down, his movements precise and controlled. His face remained unreadable, brown eyes focused straight ahead, neither meeting Wallace's gaze nor avoiding it. The boy's calm demeanor made Wallace's collar feel suddenly tight. Wallace cleared his throat. "Well then, since we're here, we might as well make the most of it." He pulled out some worksheets he'd prepared, though he wasn't entirely sure why he'd bothered. "I thought we could review the latest assignment." Jamal reached for the papers without a word, took out a pen and began working. The scratch of his pen against paper filled the uncomfortable silence. No complaint, no sigh, not even the smallest hint of resistance. "You know," Wallace tried again, forcing a lighter tone, "I was looking over your previous essays. Your analysis of Steinbeck's symbolism was quite—" He trailed off as Jamal continued writing, showing no sign of having heard him. The words hung in the air, incomplete and embarrassingly hollow. The silence stretched between them like an invisible wall. Wallace watched as Jamal's pen moved across the page with quiet efficiency, his handwriting neat and precise. There was no hesitation in his movements, no pause to consider the questions. Each answer flowed seamlessly into the next. The boy's focus was absolute, as if Wallace weren't even in the room. Wallace shifted in his chair, the leather squeaking slightly. "The weather's been quite mild for October," he attempted, knowing how pathetic it sounded even as the words left his mouth. "The football team might actually have decent conditions for Friday's game." Nothing. Not even a flicker of acknowledgement. No raised eyebrow, no slight nod. Just the steady rhythm of pen on paper. The ticking of the clock grew louder, marking each failed attempt at conversation. Wallace found himself studying Jamal's face, searching for any crack in that composed exterior. A twitch of irritation, a flash of satisfaction at his discomfort, anything. But Jamal's expression remained perfectly neutral, focused entirely on the work before him. The boy's eyelashes barely moved as he scanned each question, his breathing even and unhurried. Wallace had dealt with angry students before. He'd handled rebellion, defiance, even tears. But this calm indifference, was something entirely new. It made him feel small, insignificant, like a piece of furniture Jamal had to work around rather than a teacher commanding respect. The power dynamic he'd relied on for years was crumbling before his eyes. The worksheets that Wallace had intended to last the hour were already half completed. Jamal's pen never stopped moving, each answer demonstrating a clear understanding of the material that made the exercise itself seem pointless. Wallace had designed these questions to be challenging, yet Jamal worked through them as easily as if they were elementary school arithmetic. A drop of sweat trickled down Wallace's back. "Perhaps we could discuss your interpretation of—" Wallace started again, but his words died in his throat, as Jamal turned to the next page without pause. The rejection stung more than any outright disrespect could have. The sun had shifted, throwing different shadows across the room now. Wallace found himself watching them move across the floor, anything to avoid confronting the growing realization that he held no power here. All his years of maintaining strict control through intimidation meant nothing to this student who simply didn't care, who saw through the facade to the insecure man beneath. Jamal's pen stopped. He had finished the last question. Without ceremony, he placed the completed worksheets on Wallace's desk, the answers perfectly aligned with the margins. Then he began packing his books away, his movements unhurried but purposeful. Not a single wasted motion. Wallace picked up the papers, scanning the responses. Each answer was thorough, insightful, and completely correct. It was the kind of work that should have made any teacher proud, but instead, it left him feeling hollow, empty, exposed. The clock showed 4:30 p.m. Jamal stood up, adjusting his backpack on his shoulder. He didn't look at Wallace, didn't acknowledge him in any way. His footsteps were steady as he walked to the door, neither rushing to escape nor lingering to make a point. His silence spoke volumes. Wallace watched him leave, the sound of his footsteps fading down the hallway. The classroom felt different somehow, larger and emptier than before. The detention slip still sat on his desk, but now it seemed like nothing more than what it was, a piece of paper carrying no real weight or meaning, just like his authority. He sat there for a long moment, surrounded by the gathering shadows of late afternoon, feeling more dismissed than he had in his entire teaching career. The silence that remained wasn't just the absence of sound, it was the echo of complete indifference, and somehow, that felt worse than any outright defiance could have been. It was as if Jamal had held up a mirror, forcing Wallace to see himself clearly for the first time in years. The afternoon sun painted the classroom in familiar shades of amber, dust motes dancing in the golden beams. Mr. Wallace had arrived early again, arranging and rearranging the papers on his desk with nervous energy. His fingers drummed against the wooden surface as he waited, his mind racing with different approaches he might try today. The silence of the empty room only amplified his restlessness, making each tick of the wall clock sound like a countdown to something inevitable. When Jamal entered precisely at 3:30, Wallace noticed how the young man moved with deliberate grace, each step measured and controlled. There was something almost regal in his posture, despite the weight of his backpack. His face revealed nothing, no anger, no resentment, just calm determination that somehow made Wallace even more uneasy. "Good afternoon, Jamal," Wallace said, trying to inject warmth into his voice. The words felt strange in his mouth, like trying to speak a foreign language. He watched as Jamal settled into the same desk as yesterday, pulling out his books with methodical precision. Each movement seemed purposeful, a stark contrast to Wallace's own nervous fidgeting. Wallace cleared his throat. "I was looking through some of your earlier essays from last semester. Your analysis of Steinbeck's use of symbolism was quite—" He paused, searching for the right word. "Insightful." The compliment hung awkwardly in the air between them, genuine but coming far too late. Jamal's expression didn't change. His hands moved across the paper, pen scratching quietly as he worked on the assigned tasks. The sound seemed to fill the room, highlighting the emptiness of Wallace's attempted conversation. Wallace shifted in his chair, discomfort crawling up his spine. "Do you enjoy reading outside of class assignments? I noticed you referenced some advanced texts in your bibliography." His voice sounded too loud, too forced even to his own ears. The scratch of Jamal's pen continued, steady and uninterrupted. His focus remained unbroken, as if Wallace's words were merely another distraction to be filtered out. "I saw you carrying a copy of Baldwin's work last week," Wallace pressed on, his voice taking on an edge of desperation. "Is he one of your favorite authors?" He leaned forward slightly, searching for any sign that his words were breaking through the invisible wall between them. Still nothing, just the methodical movement of pen across paper. Jamal's breathing remained steady, his shoulders relaxed despite the tension filling the room. Wallace stood up, walking to the window. The late afternoon light hurt his eyes, but he welcomed the discomfort. It was better than the suffocating silence. "You know, when I was your age, I was drawn to authors who challenged the status quo, writers who weren't afraid to speak truth to power." His reflection in the glass looked older than he remembered, tired lines etched around his eyes. He turned back to face Jamal, noticing how the young man's hand had paused for just a fraction of a second before continuing its steady progress across the page. That tiny hesitation felt like the first real response he'd gotten, and Wallace clung to it. "I remember being particularly moved by—" Wallace started, but stopped as he realized how hollow his words sounded. Here he was, trying to connect over literature about speaking truth to power, when he had been the very authority figure abusing his position. The words died in his throat, replaced by a bitter taste of self-awareness. The irony wasn't lost on him, and he suspected it wasn't lost on Jamal either. The boy's intelligence had always been evident, even when Wallace had refused to acknowledge it. Wallace returned to his desk, sinking into his chair. "Look, Jamal, I know we've had our differences, but surely we can find some common ground." The plea in his voice surprised even himself. When had he ever begged a student for anything? For the first time that afternoon, Jamal's pen stopped moving completely. He looked up, his dark eyes meeting Wallace's with an intensity that made the teacher want to look away. But he forced himself to hold that gaze. In those eyes, Wallace saw not hatred but something far worse, a clear, unwavering judgment. "Why are you trying now?" Jamal asked, his voice even and controlled, yet somehow filling the entire room. Each word was carefully chosen, precisely delivered. The question hit Wallace like a physical blow. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken accusations. Every excuse, every justification he might have offered withered before it could be voiced. Jamal's question hung in the air, unanswered as he returned to his work. The scratch of his pen seemed louder now, each stroke an indictment of Wallace's past behavior. The rhythmic sound felt almost hypnotic, pulling Wallace deeper into uncomfortable self-reflection. Wallace sat there watching as Jamal completed the assignments with the same efficiency he'd shown yesterday. He wanted to say something else, to try to bridge the vast chasm between them, but every potential response felt inadequate. The truth was, he had no good answer for why it had taken so long to see what had always been right in front of him. The minutes ticked by, marked only by the steady movement of Jamal's pen and the distant sound of after-school traffic outside. When the hour was up, Jamal closed his book with the same careful precision he'd shown in everything else. He packed his belongings without rushing, each movement deliberate and controlled. Not a single item was dropped, not a single paper crumpled. Wallace watched as Jamal stood, straightened his desk, and walked toward the door. Not a word spoken, not a glance spared in his direction. The soft click of the door closing behind him seemed to echo in the empty classroom, a period at the end of a sentence Wallace couldn't take back. Wallace remained seated, staring at the empty desk where Jamal had sat. In all his years of teaching, in all his confrontations with students, parents, and administrators, he had never felt so completely powerless. The carefully constructed walls of his authority had been stripped away, leaving him exposed and vulnerable in the face of Jamal's quiet dignity. His own question now haunted him. Who exactly was teaching whom in these afternoon sessions? The afternoon sun had shifted, the golden light now fading to dusky purple. Wallace sat there, surrounded by lengthening shadows, unable to move from his chair as he confronted the weight of Jamal's simple question. Why are you trying now? 4 words that demanded a lifetime of honest reflection. The late afternoon sun streamed through the classroom windows, casting long shadows across the empty desks. Mr. Wallace sat alone, absently flipping through a stack of old student essays he'd found while organizing his filing cabinet. His mind wasn't really on the task. It had become a habit now, something to keep his hands busy while waiting for Jamal to arrive for their daily tutoring session. The familiar rhythm of sorting papers helped calm the strange uneasiness that had been growing in him lately. A familiar name caught his eye. Wallace paused, pulling the paper from the stack. Cultural Identity in Modern Literature by Jamal Carter, dated from the previous school year. He remembered assigning this essay, but somehow he'd never really looked at Jamal's work from before. Not properly. He'd skimmed it, graded it, but had he truly read it with open eyes? As his eyes moved across the page, Wallace's breath caught in his throat. The analysis was sophisticated, weaving together complex literary theories with personal insights. The writing style was elegant, yet precise, each paragraph building upon the last with masterful control. This wasn't just good, it was exceptional. College-level work, the kind of essay that would make any English teacher proud. The kind of writing that revealed a mind far more developed than Wallace had ever allowed himself to recognize. Wallace's hands began to shake slightly as he read further. Here was evidence of the very thing he had refused to see. Jamal's brilliance. All those times he'd called the boy out in class. All those snide comments about attitude and effort. Wallace felt something unfamiliar creeping up his spine. Shame. Raw and uncomfortable, it settled in his stomach like a heavy stone. His collar suddenly felt too tight, the classroom too warm. The sound of footsteps in the hallway made Wallace look up. Right on time, Jamal appeared in the doorway. He moved with that same quiet confidence that Wallace had always mistaken for defiance, settling into his usual seat with practiced ease. Without a word, Jamal began pulling out his books, preparing for another silent session. His movements were economical, deliberate. Nothing wasted, nothing for show. Wallace looked down at the essay in his hands, then back at Jamal. The boy's face was composed as always, revealing nothing of his thoughts. Wallace's throat felt dry as he slowly pushed the paper across the desk toward Jamal. The rustling sound seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet classroom. "You wrote this?" Wallace asked, trying to keep his voice neutral despite the turmoil inside him. He watched as Jamal glanced at the essay, recognition flickering briefly in his eyes before his expression returned to its usual careful blankness, a mask that Wallace now realized might be protection, not defiance. "Yeah," Jamal replied simply, his voice carrying neither pride nor challenge, just a statement of fact, no embellishment needed. Wallace leaned back in his chair, studying the young man before him with new eyes. How many times had he dismissed Jamal's intelligence? How many opportunities had he missed to nurture this obvious talent? The realization hit him like a physical blow. He had spent months trying to break down someone who had already proven himself capable of extraordinary work. Someone who had perhaps been waiting all along for just one teacher to truly see him. The afternoon light continued to fade as Jamal worked on his current assignment. Wallace found himself watching the boy's methodical approach, seeing it now not as stubborn resistance, but as focused determination. Every movement was purposeful, every response carefully considered. This wasn't the behavior of a problem student. It was the discipline of someone who had learned to excel despite, not because of, his teachers. A young man who had built his own path when no one would show him the way. The shame in Wallace's stomach grew heavier. He had always prided himself on being able to spot potential in his students, on knowing how to push them toward excellence. But with Jamal, he had let his own prejudices blind him. He had seen what he expected to see, what he wanted to see, rather than what was actually there. The weight of this truth pressed down on his shoulders, making him feel suddenly old and foolish. Time seemed to crawl as Wallace grappled with his revelations. The sound of Jamal's pen moving across paper filled the silence between them, steady and unwavering. Wallace thought about all the times he had interpreted that silence as insolence, when perhaps it had been patience instead. How many other students had he misjudged this way? How many bright minds had he failed to recognize because they didn't fit his narrow definition of intelligence or respect? As the session drew to a close, Jamal began packing up his materials with the same careful precision he brought to everything else. Wallace watched him, feeling strangely small in his teacher's chair. For the first time since he'd started teaching, he felt completely unworthy of his position. Here was a student who had already mastered what Wallace was supposed to be teaching, and instead of recognizing and nurturing that talent, he had tried to diminish it, had tried to make Jamal smaller so that he himself could feel bigger. Jamal stood, shouldering his backpack with quiet dignity. The essay still lay on the desk between them, a testament to Wallace's failure as an educator. For the first time, Wallace saw himself clearly in the reflection of Jamal's composure, not as the authoritative figure he'd always imagined himself to be, but as someone who had allowed his own biases to corrupt the very purpose of teaching. Someone who had forgotten that the greatest lessons often come from those we're supposed to instruct. The afternoon sun had begun its slow descent, casting a warm golden glow through the classroom windows. Mr. Wallace sat at his desk, watching as Jamal worked through the day's assignment with his usual methodical precision. The scratching of Jamal's pen against paper was the only sound that filled the otherwise silent room, punctuated occasionally by the distant shouts of students on the playing field outside. Wallace couldn't help but notice how Jamal's posture remained perfectly straight, his movements deliberate and controlled. The boy had always carried himself with a dignity that Wallace had mistaken for defiance. Now that same composure made Wallace increasingly uncomfortable, as if Jamal's very presence was a mirror reflecting back all his own failures and shortcomings. Each careful movement of Jamal's hand across the paper seemed to underscore Wallace's growing sense of unease. 20 minutes into what should have been an hour-long session, Jamal set down his pen with a soft click. He had completed the entire assignment, work that should have taken much longer, work that Wallace had assigned specifically to keep him occupied and humbled. Wallace watched as Jamal carefully reviewed his answers, his dark eyes scanning the page with careful attention, his finger occasionally tracing a line of text. Then, instead of packing up immediately as he usually did, Jamal looked up. His gaze met Wallace's directly, unwavering. "Why do you hate me so much?" The words were simple, delivered without drama or accusation, yet they carried the weight of months of silent endurance. The question hung in the air like a physical thing, almost visible in the dust motes dancing in the sunbeams. Wallace felt his throat constrict, his mind suddenly blank. The classroom seemed to grow smaller, the late afternoon light somehow harsher, more revealing. He opened his mouth, but no words came out, just a small intake of breath. Jamal's voice had been quiet, controlled, but there was an edge to it now that Wallace had never heard before. It wasn't anger exactly. It was something more precise, more cutting. It was the voice of someone who had been watching, waiting and measuring every interaction, storing away each slight and dismissal like evidence in a case that was now finally being presented. Wallace started, then stopped. His hands felt clammy against the desk, and he resisted the urge to wipe them on his pants. "I don't hate you." The words sounded hollow even to his own ears, empty of conviction and truth. Jamal tilted his head slightly, his expression unchanged, but his eyes intensely focused, like a scientist observing a specimen. "Then why do you treat me like you do?" Wallace felt the question like a physical blow to his chest. His mind raced through all the moments, calling Jamal out in class, questioning his work, the snide comments, the assumptions, the extra assignments, the times he'd ignored Jamal's raised hand. Each memory now felt like evidence being presented in a court where he stood accused, with no jury but his own conscience. He searched for an explanation, an excuse, anything that would justify his behavior. But looking at Jamal now, seeing the quiet intelligence in those eyes, Wallace realized he had nothing. No defense. No rational explanation that wouldn't reveal his own prejudices, his own failures as an educator and as a human being. The silence between them grew heavier with each passing second. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words and painful truths. Wallace watched as Jamal's gaze moved over his face, reading every micro-expression, every twitch of discomfort, every moment of realization. The boy's composure never wavered, but there was something in his eyes. Not triumph, but a kind of sad understanding that seemed beyond his years. Without another word, Jamal began gathering his things. His movements were unhurried, methodical, almost graceful in their efficiency. He slipped his completed assignment into a folder, tucked his pen into his bag, and stood up. The chair scraped quietly against the floor as he pushed it back, the sound unnaturally loud in the silent room. Wallace wanted to say something, anything to break the silence, to offer some kind of explanation or apology. But the words wouldn't come, trapped behind a lifetime of pride and prejudice. He watched, helpless, as Jamal walked to the door, his footsteps echoing in the quiet room, each one seeming to say, "This is who you are. This is what you've done." Just before leaving, Jamal paused, his hand resting lightly on the doorframe. For a moment, Wallace thought he might turn around, might say something else, might offer some path to redemption. But then Jamal stepped through the doorway and was gone, leaving Wallace alone with the weight of his own silence and the crushing burden of unspoken truths. The empty classroom seemed to mock him now, every desk, every book, every poster on the wall a witness to his failure. Wallace slumped in his chair, his carefully maintained authority crumbling around him like a sandcastle at high tide. His eyes fixed on the desk where Jamal had been sitting, now empty, save for the lingering afternoon sunlight that stretched across its surface, highlighting the small marks and scratches of countless students who had come and gone. For the first time in his teaching career, Wallace felt small. Not just small, diminished, hollowed out. All his years of maintaining control through intimidation, all his certainty about knowing which students were worth his time and which weren't, all of it felt meaningless now, exposed as the petty power plays of an insecure man. He had spent so much energy trying to put Jamal in his place, never realizing that he was the one who had been small all along. The silence in the room pressed in on him, broken only by the distant sound of students leaving their after-school activities, their muffled laughter and chatter a stark contrast to the heavy atmosphere in his classroom. A clock ticked somewhere, marking the seconds of this new, uncomfortable self-awareness. Wallace remained motionless, staring at that empty desk, unable to shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted, not in Jamal, but in himself, as if a veil had been lifted from his eyes. His own reflection stared back at him from the darkening window, and for the first time, Wallace didn't recognize the person he saw there. The stranger's eyes looked haunted, uncertain. The man who had walked into this classroom this afternoon was not the same one sitting there now, made small by the quiet dignity of a student he had so grievously underestimated and whose simple question had shattered the comfortable illusions of a lifetime. The streetlights cast long shadows through Wallace's living room window, creating strange patterns on the scattered papers covering his coffee table. He'd been sitting here for hours, unable to sleep, Jamal's words echoing in his mind. "Why do you hate me so much?" Wallace rubbed his tired eyes, the question gnawing at him like a persistent ache. He'd come home, tried to grade papers, tried to watch TV, tried to do anything to distract himself. Nothing worked. The cold coffee on the side table stood untouched, a testament to his distraction. Finally, he'd pulled out his teaching files, searching for something. An answer, a justification, anything to quiet the voice in his head. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for another folder. This one was older, transferred from Crestwood Middle School when Jamal moved up to high school. The edges were worn, the paper faded to a dull yellow. Wallace had never bothered to look at it before. Why would he? He'd made up his mind about Jamal Carter long ago. The folder was thick, stuffed with documents practically bursting at the seams. Wallace opened it, and the first page made him pause. A perfect report card, all A's, not a single blemish. The neat rows of grades stared back at him accusingly. He flipped to the next page. Another perfect report card. And another. And another. "This can't be right," Wallace muttered to himself, leaning forward in his chair. His reading glasses slipped down his nose as he scrutinized the papers more closely. But there it was, in black and white. Year after year of academic excellence. His eyes caught on a newspaper clipping tucked between the pages, its edges slightly yellowed with age. It showed a younger Jamal, maybe 12 or 13, standing proudly next to a science fair project, The headline read, "Local student takes first place in state science competition." The boy in the photo wore the same composed expression Wallace knew so well, but there was something else there too. A quiet joy in his eyes, a subtle smile that spoke of genuine passion for learning. The project behind him was clearly advanced, something about renewable energy that looked more like a college-level presentation than middle school work. Wallace's hands felt heavy as he set down the clipping. His fingers left slight tremors in the paper as he reached for another document, a letter of recommendation from Jamal's 8th grade English teacher, written in elegant cursive. "Jamal Carter is, without question, one of the most gifted students I have encountered in my 20 years of teaching. His analytical skills are far beyond his years, matched only by his dedication to learning. But what truly sets Jamal apart is his character, his quiet determination, his unfailing politeness, his willingness to help struggling classmates. In all my years of teaching, I have rarely seen such a perfect combination of intellectual ability and human decency." Wallace's throat tightened. A bead of sweat rolled down his temple despite the cool room. He remembered how he'd dismissed Jamal's first essay in his class, convinced it must have been plagiarized. No student could write that well, he'd thought, especially not. He couldn't even finish the thought now. The shame of it burned in his chest, making it hard to swallow. More documents spilled out of the folder, cascading onto his coffee table like autumn leaves. Academic awards, math competition certificates, a letter commending Jamal for tutoring younger students, a glowing evaluation from the school counselor noting his exceptional maturity and resilience in the face of challenges. Each piece of paper felt like another weight on Wallace's conscience. Not a single disciplinary notice, not one complaint from any teacher, no behavioral issues, not even a tardy slip. Nothing to suggest anything but a model student who had consistently exceeded every expectation set before him. Wallace's eyes fell on another photo, this one from an academic decathlon. Jamal stood at a podium, holding a trophy, that same dignified composure evident even then. But what caught Wallace's attention was the pride in Jamal's posture, the subtle confidence of someone who knew their worth. The trophy gleamed in his hands, and the smile on his face was genuine, unguarded. What had happened to that confidence? Wallace knew the answer, and it made his stomach turn. He had happened. With every dismissive comment, every unfair accusation, every moment of unearned suspicion, he had tried to dim that light. Each sneer, each cutting remark, each prejudiced assumption had been another attempt to extinguish the brilliance that was so clearly documented in these pages. Yet Jamal hadn't broken. He hadn't lashed out or given up. He had maintained his dignity, his excellence, his composure. Not because he was defiant, but because that's who he was, who he had always been. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable, and damning. Wallace pushed himself up from his chair, suddenly needing to move. His legs felt unsteady beneath him as he paced his living room, the weight of his realizations making it hard to breathe. The room seemed to spin around him as years of misconceptions crumbled. All those times he'd called Jamal difficult, all those times he'd assumed the worst, all those times he'd tried to prove the boy was trouble. It had never been about Jamal at all. It had been about Wallace. His own biases, his own assumptions, his own need to feel in control, his own fear of being proven wrong, of having his worldview challenged, of facing the truth about himself. He stopped at his window, staring out at the quiet street below. The streetlights cast an amber glow on the empty sidewalks, and in the reflection of the glass, he caught sight of himself and barely recognized the man looking back. The lines around his mouth seemed deeper, his expression harder than he remembered. How had he become this person? When had he stopped being a teacher and become this? The memory of Jamal's question came back again, sharper now, more cutting. "Why do you hate me so much?" Wallace walked back to his couch and slumped down heavily, his eyes fixed on the ceiling. The answer was there, in all those papers spread across his coffee table. In every achievement he'd refused to acknowledge, every success he'd tried to diminish, every moment of brilliance he'd tried to deny. The evidence of his failure as an educator, and more importantly as a human being, lay scattered around him like fallen leaves. He didn't hate Jamal. He hated what Jamal represented. A challenge to his prejudices, a mirror showing him his own failures, a reminder of how far he'd strayed from the teacher he'd once wanted to be. Each accolade in that folder was another crack in the wall of justifications he'd built around himself. The realization settled over him like a heavy blanket. He was the villain in this story, not Jamal. Never Jamal. All this time, he'd been fighting against a ghost of his own creation, trying to tear down a student who had done nothing but excel despite every obstacle Wallace had placed in his path. The truth was inescapable now, written in black and white across dozens of documents. Wallace lay there in his dimly lit living room, surrounded by the evidence of his own failure, not as a teacher, but as a human being. The streetlight outside flickered, casting shifting shadows across the ceiling, but Wallace barely noticed. He was too lost in the understanding of what he had become, and the crushing weight of knowing he had no one to blame but himself. The night stretched ahead of him, long and dark, filled with the echoes of his own conscience. The afternoon sun slanted through the classroom windows, casting long rectangles of light across the empty desks. Wallace sat at his desk, his posture different today, less rigid, more uncertain. The stack of papers in front of him seemed to mock his previous certainties, each page a reminder of how wrong he'd been. His hands, usually steady and quick to judge with his red pen, now rested quietly on the desktop. When Jamal walked in exactly on time as always, Wallace noticed things he'd somehow missed before. The careful way Jamal arranged his materials on the desk, the quiet confidence in his movements, the intelligence in his eyes that Wallace had previously mistaken for defiance. Even the way he carried himself spoke of a dignity that Wallace had willfully ignored for too long. "Good afternoon, Jamal," Wallace said, his voice lacking its usual sharp edge. The words felt strange in his mouth, stripped of their usual authority. Jamal glanced up briefly, surprise flickering across his face at the gentler tone, before returning to his usual composed expression. He pulled out his notebook and began working on the assigned tasks, his pen moving smoothly across the paper. The scratch of his writing filled the room with a steady rhythm. Wallace watched him work, really seeing him for the first time. No fidgeting, no wasted movements. Each sentence carefully constructed, each thought clearly expressed. How had he missed this before? The precision, the focus, the natural talent that practically radiated from every word Jamal wrote. The boy's concentration was absolute, his dedication evident in every line he composed. 20 minutes passed in silence, but it felt different today. Not tense or hostile, just quiet. When Jamal finished and handed over his work, Wallace didn't immediately start marking it up with his red pen as he usually did. Instead, he simply read it, taking in the words, following the flow of ideas. His fingers, which usually itched to correct and criticize, remained still. The essay was about the symbolism in The Great Gatsby, and Jamal's analysis went far deeper than Wallace had expected. He found connections that even Wallace, with his years of teaching the novel, hadn't considered. The writing was clear, elegant, and insightful. Each paragraph built upon the last with a sophistication that spoke of both natural talent and careful study. From the corner of his eye, Wallace could see Jamal watching him. Not obviously, Jamal was too careful for that, but Wallace could feel the student's attention, could sense him noting the absence of the usual red pen assault on his work. The boy's shoulders were tense, braced for the criticism that had become routine. Wallace read through the essay a second time, then carefully set it down on his desk. He took a deep breath, pushing aside his pride, his prejudices, his need to maintain authority. "This is excellent," he said, his voice softer than usual, genuine admiration replacing his habitual condescension. The words felt like a confession. Jamal blinked, his carefully maintained mask of indifference slipping for just a moment. He looked at Wallace directly, not with the usual calculated blankness or carefully hidden anger, but with something new, curiosity. Their eyes met, and for the first time, there was no battle of wills, no silent power struggle. The air between them seemed to clear, like storm clouds parting. "Your analysis of the green light?" Wallace continued, tapping the paper gently. "It's particularly insightful. I've never considered its connection to the American dream quite this way before. His finger rested on a passage that had genuinely surprised him with its depth of understanding. Jamal's expression remained careful, but something shifted in his posture. He sat a little straighter, his eyes focused more intently on Wallace. The change was subtle, but it was there, a crack in the wall of silence he'd built between them. His hands, usually kept still in his lap, moved slightly forward on the desk. "You've clearly put a lot of thought into this," Wallace said, sliding the paper back across the desk. No red marks marred its surface, no cutting comments lined its margins. Just clean, unmarked paper containing excellent work that finally received the recognition it deserved. The pristine white pages seemed to glow in the afternoon light. Jamal reached for the essay, his movements measured and controlled as always, but his fingers lingered on the paper for a moment longer than necessary, as if verifying the absence of corrections. His eyes scanned the pristine pages, then lifted to meet Wallace's gaze again. Something flickered in their depths, not quite trust, but perhaps the seed of understanding. The silence between them felt different now, less like a weapon and more like a space where something new might grow. The afternoon light had shifted, throwing different shadows across the classroom floor, and Wallace felt the change in the air, subtle but undeniable. Even the familiar classroom seemed transformed, as if they were seeing it through new eyes. When the session ended, Jamal gathered his things with his usual efficiency. He slipped the unmarked essay carefully into his folder, tucked his pen into his backpack pocket. But as he stood to leave, something changed in his routine. At the doorway, he paused. For the first time since these sessions began, Jamal glanced back at Wallace, a brief look that carried neither anger nor dismissal. It was a small gesture, but it felt monumental in its significance. Then he was gone, his footsteps echoing down the empty hallway, leaving Wallace alone in the classroom that suddenly felt different than it had just an hour before. The sound of his departure seemed to hang in the air like the last note of a changing melody. Wallace sat at his desk, looking at the space where Jamal had been sitting. The hostility that had filled this room for so long had lifted, replaced by something else. Something that felt like the possibility of change. Not forgiveness, not yet. But maybe, just maybe, a first step toward something better. The afternoon sun continued its slow journey across the floor, marking the moment when something fundamental had shifted between teacher and student. The teacher's lounge was quiet that Monday morning, filled with the gentle hum of the coffee maker and the rustle of newspapers. Sunlight streamed through the Venetian blinds, creating striped patterns on the worn linoleum floor. Wallace sat in his usual corner chair, stirring his coffee absently while reviewing his lesson plans for the day. The familiar routine felt different somehow, as if he were going through the motions of his old life while standing just slightly outside of it. The door creaked open, and Ms. Reed's sharp voice cut through the peaceful atmosphere. She wasn't alone. Trailing behind her was Marcus Johnson, a sophomore who Wallace recognized from the hallways. The boy's shoulders were hunched, his eyes fixed on the floor, his entire posture screaming discomfort. "I don't understand why you can't grasp basic algebra," Ms. Reed was saying, her tone dripping with disdain. "Everyone else in class seems to manage just fine. Perhaps if you spent less time drawing in your notebook and more time paying attention." Wallace's hand tightened around his coffee cup. The words were different, but the tone, that condescending, dismissive tone, was painfully familiar. He'd used it himself, countless times, with Jamal and others. The realization sat like a stone in his stomach, heavy and uncomfortable. Marcus shifted his weight from one foot to the other, clutching his textbook closer to his chest as if it might shield him from the verbal assault. "I was paying attention, Ms. Reed. I got confused about the negative numbers and—" "Confused?" Ms. Reed's laugh was sharp and cold, cutting through the boy's explanation like a knife. "This is 10th grade math, Mr. Johnson. We're not in elementary school anymore. If you can't keep up, perhaps you should consider—" "That's enough." The words left Wallace's mouth before he could stop them. His own voice sounded strange to his ears, firm but quiet, nothing like his usual classroom tone. Both Ms. Reed and Marcus turned to look at him, surprise evident on their faces. The other teachers in the lounge paused mid-sip of their coffees, suddenly alert. Wallace set down his coffee cup and stood up. His heart was pounding, but his voice remained steady. "Marcus, why don't you head to the library? I believe Mrs. Chen is available for math tutoring before first period. She's excellent at explaining things differently when students are stuck." Marcus glanced between the two teachers, clearly uncertain, caught in the crossfire of adult tension. Wallace gave him a small nod of encouragement, and the boy practically fled the room, the door swinging shut behind him with a soft click of relief. Ms. Reed's expression shifted from surprise to amusement, her eyebrows arching high above her wire-rimmed glasses. Well, since when do you care about coddling students, Wallace? Weren't you just complaining last week about how standards have fallen and kids these days need more discipline, not less? Wallace felt heat rise to his face, but he held her gaze. In her words, in her stance, in the dismissive wave of her hand, he saw himself, the person he'd been just days ago. The person who'd torn down students instead of building them up, who'd mistaken cruelty for discipline, who'd hidden behind authority rather than embracing responsibility. "We're supposed to teach them," he said quietly, "not tear them down. There's a difference between having high standards and humiliating a kid who's trying." Ms. Reed's amusement turned to confusion, her smirk faltering at the edges. "Oh, please. Don't tell me you're going soft now. You, of all people? The man who's been arguing for stricter discipline since day one? The one who said some students just don't have what it takes?" Other teachers in the lounge had stopped pretending to read their papers, watching the exchange with poorly concealed interest. Wallace could feel their eyes on him, could sense their curiosity about this unexpected confrontation. The silence in the room felt charged, expectant. "Since when do you care?" Ms. Reed pressed, her voice taking on an edge of challenge, as if daring him to defend this apparent change of heart. Wallace looked at the empty doorway where Marcus had stood moments before, remembering how small the boy had seemed under Ms. Reed's verbal assault. He thought of Jamal, brilliant, resilient Jamal, and how many times he must have felt the same way in Wallace's classroom. The memory stung, sharp and fresh. The question hung in the air between them. "Since when do you care?" Wallace had no answer. How could he explain the transformation of the past week? How could he describe the shame of discovering his own prejudices, the gut-wrenching realization that he'd been wrong about so much for so long? How could he put into words the way his entire worldview had shifted on its axis? He couldn't find the words to explain his change of heart, couldn't articulate the profound shift in his perspective. But deep down, he knew he wasn't the same man he was. The Wallace who would have joined Ms. Reed in berating a struggling student was gone, replaced by someone who was still finding his way, still learning how to be better, still figuring out what it meant to truly teach. The bell rang, saving him from having to respond. Teachers began gathering their materials, heading out to their classrooms with renewed energy and purpose. Ms. Reed gave him one last puzzled look before turning away, muttering something under her breath about going soft and losing his edge. Wallace remained standing in the teacher's lounge, his coffee growing cold on the table beside him. The morning sun continued to stream through the blinds, the striped shadows now seeming less like prison bars and more like bridges, connecting who he was to who he was becoming, illuminating a path forward he hadn't seen before. The question still echoed in his mind, "Since when do you care?" He didn't have an answer, but for the first time in his teaching career, he was starting to understand what caring really meant. And maybe, just maybe, that understanding was worth more than any answer he could give. The Monday morning hallways buzzed with an unusual energy. Wallace noticed it the moment he stepped through Crestwood High's main entrance. Students clustered in tight groups, heads bent over glowing phone screens, their whispers creating a constant hum that seemed to follow him down the corridor. At first, he tried to ignore it. Monday mornings were always strange, teenagers still shaking off their weekend stupor. But this felt different. As he passed each group, conversations would suddenly stop. Eyes would dart away from his, then back to their phones. "Did you see it?" a girl whispered to her friend, not quite quiet enough. "I can't believe he actually..." The rest was lost in the shuffle of bodies and backpacks. But Wallace felt a familiar tightness in his chest. Something was wrong. Very wrong. The air itself seemed charged with anticipation, like everyone was waiting for something to happen. Outside his classroom, a group of seniors quickly dispersed as he approached, shoving phones into pockets and avoiding eye contact. The atmosphere was thick with tension, like the air before a storm. One boy actually stepped back, creating distance between them as Wallace reached for his keys. Wallace unlocked his classroom door, his hands slightly unsteady. The fluorescent lights flickered to life, revealing Jamal already seated at his desk. The sight stopped Wallace cold. Jamal's usual composed demeanor was gone, replaced by something rigid and tense. His hands were clasped tightly on the desktop, knuckles white with pressure. There was a new resolve in his posture. The quiet dignity he always carried now seemed fortified with something else. Purpose, perhaps. Other students filed in slowly, unusually quiet for a Monday morning. The typical chatter and laughter were replaced by meaningful glances and hushed whispers. Wallace could feel their eyes on him as he moved to his desk, could sense the weight of their judgment. Some students who normally greeted him with respect now slipped past without a word, finding their seats with unusual haste. His laptop powered on with a gentle hum. The screen lit up, revealing 3 new emails in his inbox. The top one, marked urgent in bold red letters, was from Principal Carter. Wallace's mouth went dry. With trembling fingers, he clicked the email open. Mr. Wallace, this matter requires immediate attention. The attached video has been circulating among students since early this morning. Please review it immediately and report to my office before second period. Principal Carter. The video attachment sat there, innocent and damning. Wallace clicked play, though deep down he already knew what he would see. His heart hammered against his ribs as the video began to load. The footage was shaky at first, clearly taken on a student's phone held below desk level, but the audio was crystal clear. Wallace watched himself from 3 months ago, standing at the front of the classroom, his face twisted with contempt. Mr. Carter, his recorded voice dripped with sarcasm. Since you seem to think you're smarter than everyone else in this room, why don't you explain to the class why your interpretation is so unique? The camera panned to Jamal, who sat straight-backed, face carefully blank despite the snickers from some classmates. The boy's composure was remarkable, a stark contrast to Wallace's barely controlled disdain. No answer? I thought not. Video Wallace's voice grew harder. Perhaps next time you'll think twice before challenging the assigned reading with your creative analysis. The Wallace on screen continued his verbal assault, systematically dismantling Jamal's thoughtful interpretation of the text, turning what had been an insightful literary analysis into a public humiliation. The worst part was watching Jamal's face throughout the ordeal, the way he maintained his dignity even as Wallace tried to strip it away. Not once did the boy's expression crack, though Wallace could now see the subtle signs of hurt he'd been too blind to notice before. A slight tightening around the eyes, a barely perceptible swallow. The video ended, but Wallace couldn't move. The timestamp showed it had been uploaded to social media late last night. The view count was already in the thousands. Comments flooded the section below. Parents, students, even teachers from other schools expressing their outrage. He looked up from his laptop, his stomach churning. The classroom had filled while he watched the video. Every student was staring at their desk, except for Jamal, who met his gaze steadily across the room. There was no triumph in those eyes, no satisfaction at Wallace's public exposure, just the same quiet strength that had been there all along. It was as if Jamal wasn't seeking revenge, but justice, a distinction Wallace was only now beginning to understand. The bell rang, startlingly loud in the silent classroom. Wallace stood up, his legs unsteady. His carefully prepared lesson plan seemed meaningless now. How could he stand in front of these students and teach, knowing what they had all seen, knowing what they now knew about him? The pages of notes he'd prepared over the weekend lay forgotten on his desk, suddenly as worthless as his reputation. A phone buzzed somewhere in the room, then another, and another, the sound of notifications spreading like wildfire through the school. carrying his shame with them. He could imagine the video being shared in every classroom, every hallway, every corner of Crestwood High. Parents would see it next, then the school board. His career, the only thing he'd ever truly valued, was disintegrating before his eyes. The weight of his actions, captured and preserved for all to see, pressed down on him like a physical force. He had thought he was changing, thought he was becoming better. But there it was, irrefutable evidence of who he had been, who he still was, in many people's eyes now. The man in that video wasn't a stranger. It was him, stripped of pretense, his ugliness exposed for all to witness. He looked at his students again, really looked at them. Some seemed angry, others disappointed. A few looked almost scared, as if seeing him for the first time and not liking what they found. The trust he had built over years of teaching, the authority he had wielded so carelessly, it was all crumbling around him. Students who once hung on his every word now couldn't even meet his gaze. And Jamal just watched him, his expression unreadable but his eyes never wavering. In that moment, Wallace realized that this boy, whom he had tried so hard to break, was actually stronger than he had ever been. There was a lesson here, one Wallace should have been teaching all along instead of trying to assert his dominance. The whispers from the hallway had followed him in, seeping under the door and through the walls. The entire school was turning against him, and he had no one to blame but himself. His past actions, preserved in digital permanence, were now his judge and jury. Every second that ticked by on the classroom clock felt like another nail in the coffin of his teaching career. The classroom felt like it was shrinking, the walls closing in with each passing second. Every buzz of a phone, every whispered comment, every averted gaze, they all screamed the same message. There was no coming back from this. The man who had prided himself on maintaining control, on wielding authority through fear and intimidation, now stood exposed and powerless before the very students he had once dominated. The irony wasn't lost on him. He who had made others feel small was now diminished beyond measure. The walk to Principal Carter's office felt like the longest of Wallace's life. Each step echoed through the empty hallway, a steady drumbeat counting down to what he knew would be the end of his career. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, casting long shadows that seemed to point accusingly at him as he walked. His shoes squeaked against the polished floor, the sound unnaturally loud in the silence. He paused outside the heavy wooden door, its brass nameplate gleaming. David Carter, Principal. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for the handle. Through the frosted glass, he could make out Carter's silhouette sitting ramrod straight behind his desk. Wallace swallowed hard, his throat suddenly dry as sandpaper. Wallace knocked softly, then entered when he heard a quiet, "Come in." Principal Carter sat there, his face unreadable, hands folded on his desk. The room felt smaller than usual, the walls closing in. Certificates and awards that usually provided a warm backdrop now seemed to stare down at Wallace in judgment. Family photos on the bookshelf showed smiling faces, including one of a younger Jamal, that pierced Wallace with silent reproach. The silence stretched between them like a physical thing. Wallace remained standing, his legs unwilling to move toward the chair that waited for him. The only sound was the soft ticking of the wall clock and the distant hum of the air conditioning. Outside, a bird chirped cheerfully, oblivious to the tension within these four walls. Carter didn't gesture for him to sit, didn't speak, just watched him with dark eyes that seemed to see right through every defense Wallace had ever built. His stillness was more intimidating than any shouting could have been. The quiet became unbearable. Wallace cleared his throat, opened his mouth to speak, but Carter's slight head shake stopped him cold. The message was clear. "You've done enough talking." More silence. Wallace's collar felt too tight. Sweat beaded on his forehead and trickled down his temple. He'd been in this office countless times before, always the confident one, always sure of his position and authority. Now he felt like a student himself, waiting for punishment. His fingers fidgeted with the button on his jacket. The wall clock ticked away another minute, then another. Each second felt like an eternity. Finally, Carter spoke, his voice low and controlled. You should have been gone months ago." The words hit Wallace like a physical blow. He stepped forward, his hands gripping the back of the chair in front of him until his knuckles turned white. "David, I can explain." "No." Carter's voice cut through the air like a knife. "You can't." He leaned forward slightly, his eyes never leaving Wallace's face. "I trusted you to fix this." Wallace's grip tightened on the chair. "I'm trying." "Trying?" Carter's laugh held no humor. "The entire school sees what you really are now. Every student, every parent, every teacher." He gestured to his computer screen, where the video sat paused. "They see exactly what kind of man you are." Wallace sank into the chair, his legs finally giving out. "I know I made mistakes." "Mistakes?" Carter's voice rose slightly. "Is that what you call systematically breaking down a student's spirit? Humiliating him in front of his peers? Creating an environment so hostile that other students felt compelled to document it?" His fingers tapped once on the desk, the only sign of his tightly controlled anger. The office seemed to spin around Wallace. He'd rehearsed explanations on his way here, prepared defenses and apologies. But faced with Carter's quiet fury, they all crumbled to dust. His mouth opened and closed, no words coming out. "I gave you chances," Carter continued, each word measured and precise. "When Jamal first came to me, I could have fired you then. But I thought, foolishly, that you could learn, that you could grow." He shook his head slowly. "I was wrong." Wallace stared at his hands, unable to meet Carter's gaze. "I am learning," he whispered. "I see now what I—" "Too late." Carter's words fell like a gavel. "Far too late." The silence returned, heavier than before. Through the window, Wallace could hear students leaving for the day, their voices carrying up from the parking lot. Normal sounds, everyday sounds. Soon they would be sounds he'd no longer hear. The laughter of teenagers, the slam of locker doors, the buzz of the final bell, all of it slipping away from him. Carter reached down and pulled out a folder from his desk drawer. The motion was deliberate, almost ceremonial. The manila folder looked innocent enough, but Wallace knew what it contained. His termination papers. The end of his teaching career. He sat frozen, watching as Carter placed the folder on his desk. 25 years of teaching, hundreds of students, countless lessons, all about to end in this quiet office on a Tuesday afternoon. His legacy reduced to this moment, this failure. The folder sat between them like a verdict. The heavy office door swung open with a soft creak, making Wallace's heart skip a beat. He turned, expecting perhaps another administrator or a witness to his downfall. Instead, Jamal Carter stood in the doorway, his expression as composed as ever. The afternoon light from the hallway created a silhouette around him, making him appear almost ethereal for a moment before he stepped into the office. Principal Carter's eyebrows rose slightly, the only indication of his surprise at his son's appearance. His hand remained on the folder, but he made no move to open it. The room's tension shifted, morphing into something different, less certain. Jamal didn't look for a chair or wait for an invitation. He simply stood there, his backpack still slung over one shoulder, his posture relaxed but purposeful. His eyes moved between Wallace and his father, taking in the scene before him with that same quiet observation that Wallace had come to recognize during their tutoring sessions. The silence in the room felt different now, charged with possibility rather than doom. Wallace's hands, which had been clenched in his lap, slowly uncurled. He watched Jamal, trying to read the young man's face, but found it as inscrutable as ever. "I leaked the video," Jamal said, his voice clear and steady. The words hit Wallace like a physical blow. His stomach dropped, and he felt the blood drain from his face. Of course it was Jamal. Who else would have had more reason? Who else had suffered more under his cruelty? Wallace's vision blurred slightly at the edges as the reality of it sank in. Principal Carter sat up straighter, his expression shifting between surprise and something else. Pride, perhaps. He didn't speak, though, letting his son control the moment. Wallace's mind raced through the implications. If Jamal had leaked the video, then this wasn't just about the incident captured on film. This was about everything. Every dismissive comment, every unfair grade, every moment of humiliation. Jamal had waited, gathered his evidence, and struck when it would hurt the most. It was brilliant, really. Wallace almost wanted to laugh at the poetry of it all. But then Jamal spoke again, his words cutting through Wallace's spiral of thoughts. "But I'm not here to get you fired." Wallace's head snapped up, his eyes searching Jamal's face for any sign of sarcasm or cruelty. There was none. Just that same steady gaze, that same quiet strength that had withstood months of Wallace's worst behavior. The office seemed to hold its breath. Even the usual sounds of the school faded away, as if the world itself was waiting to see what would happen next. Principal Carter's hand had moved away from the folder now, his attention fully focused on his son. Wallace struggled to process what was happening. His mind couldn't quite grasp the contradiction. Jamal had exposed him, had shown the whole school what kind of teacher he truly was, but didn't want him fired? It made no sense. The confusion must have shown on his face because Jamal's expression softened slightly, almost imperceptibly. The young man shifted his weight, adjusting his backpack strap in a gesture that reminded Wallace that, for all his composure, Jamal was still just a student who had endured more than he should have had to, yet stood here now, somehow rising above it all. Wallace stared at Jamal, trying to understand. He saw now what he should have seen months ago: the quiet dignity, the intellectual depth, the moral strength that had nothing to do with defiance and everything to do with character. The realization made his throat tight with shame. The afternoon sun had shifted, casting long shadows across the office floor. They stretched between the three of them like physical connections, linking their fates together in this moment. Wallace felt suspended between what he had been and what he might become, waiting for Jamal to explain why he wasn't calling for the ultimate punishment. Principal Carter remained silent, but his posture had changed. The stern administrator was gone, replaced by a father watching his son with barely concealed pride. The folder that had seemed so final just moments ago now lay forgotten on the desk, its importance diminished by Jamal's unexpected presence, and even more unexpected words. Wallace's mind raced back through every interaction with Jamal, the silent tutoring sessions, the recent changes, the moment Jamal had asked him why he hated him. Each memory shifted and realigned itself in light of this new development. Jamal hadn't just been enduring. He had been watching, evaluating, perhaps even hoping for something Wallace was only now beginning to understand. The room waited, charged with potential, as Wallace tried to make sense of why this young man, whom he had wronged so deeply, would choose this moment to show mercy. The question burned in his eyes as he looked at Jamal, trying to understand why. The silence in Principal Carter's office felt electric as Jamal took a deep breath. Wallace could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears, waiting for whatever came next. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the institutional furniture and making everyone look slightly washed out. The ticking of the wall clock seemed unnaturally loud in the tension-filled room. "He's changed," Jamal said simply, his voice carrying a weight that made Wallace's head snap up in disbelief. The words hung in the air like something physical. Wallace's mouth fell open slightly, his mind struggling to process what he'd just heard. He gripped the arms of his chair, knuckles turning white, a tremor running through his hands. After everything, after the video, after the humiliation, after all of it, these were the last words he'd expected to hear from Jamal's lips. It felt like the ground beneath him had shifted. Principal Carter uncrossed his arms and leaned forward slightly, his expression thoughtful as he studied his son. The leather of his chair creaked softly with the movement. "Explain," he said, his tone measured but curious, eyes narrowing slightly. Jamal shifted his weight, adjusting his backpack strap, but his gaze remained steady, his shoulders squared with quiet confidence. "I leaked that video because I wanted him to understand something." He paused, looking directly at Wallace now. "I wanted you to know what it feels like, to be powerless, to have everyone watching you, judging you, whispering about you, to feel like you don't belong in your own skin." Wallace felt each word like a knife to his gut. His throat tightened as memories flooded back, all the times he'd done exactly that to Jamal, putting him on display, making him feel small. The shame burned hot in his chest, making it hard to breathe. "Every day in your class," Jamal continued, his voice remaining remarkably calm, "I felt like I was under a microscope. Everything I did, everything I said, you turned it into a spectacle. You made sure everyone knew you thought I didn't belong there. You made me doubt myself even when I knew I was right." Principal Carter's jaw tightened slightly, but he remained silent, letting his son speak. The afternoon sun slanted through the blinds, creating bars of light across the carpet between them. His fingers laced together as he listened, his wedding ring catching the light. But firing him? Jamal shook his head slowly. That would be too easy. He took a step forward, his shoes silent on the carpet. "These past few weeks during tutoring, I've watched you change, Mr. Wallace. At first, I thought you were just trying to save yourself, but then I saw something different. Something real." Wallace remembered the moment he'd found Jamal's old essay, the sick feeling in his stomach when he'd realized how wrong he'd been. He remembered stepping in to defend that student from Ms. Reed, surprising even himself. The memory of his own voice standing up for what was right still felt strange to him. "You started actually reading my work," Jamal continued. "You stopped trying to find mistakes that weren't there. You started asking questions instead of making assumptions. And then yesterday, in the hallway, I saw you stand up for Marcus when Ms. Reed was treating him the same way you used to treat me. That wasn't for show. You didn't know anyone was watching." Principal Carter's eyebrows rose slightly at this new information, his gaze shifting between his son and Wallace. A subtle change passed over his face, not quite softening, but recalculating. "The thing is," Jamal said, his voice taking on a softer tone, "anyone can get fired, anyone can be punished, but actually changing? Actually understanding what you did wrong and trying to be better?" He shook his head. "That's harder. That's what really matters. That's what might actually help other students who come after me." Wallace felt tears pricking at the corners of his eyes. He blinked hard, trying to maintain his composure, but the emotion threatened to overwhelm him. The shame of his actions, the gravity of Jamal's words, the unexpected grace being offered. It was almost too much to bear. His vision blurred as he stared at the floor. Principal Carter uncrossed his legs and leaned back in his chair, studying Wallace with new eyes. His expression remained stern, but there was something else there now, a glimmer of consideration. His fingers drummed once on the desk before going still. "When I leaked that video," Jamal said, "I wanted everyone to see what you really were. But maybe they also need to see what you could become." He adjusted his backpack again, standing straighter. "Firing you would just make you another cautionary tale. But if you stay, if you keep changing, you could be something else. An example of how people can learn and grow. How teachers can do better." Wallace found himself holding his breath, hardly daring to move. The weight of Jamal's words filled the room, making the air feel thick and heavy. A tear escaped despite his efforts, tracking down his cheek. Principal Carter sighed deeply and looked at Wallace, his expression both tired and resolute. "You owe him more than just an apology," he said firmly, breaking his silence at last. "You owe him, and every student like him, a commitment to do better. Every single day." Wallace nodded quickly, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. He knew Carter was right. An apology wouldn't begin to cover what he owed Jamal, not just for the past abuse, but for this unexpected moment of grace, this chance at redemption he didn't deserve. His hands trembled as he wiped at his face. The afternoon sun continued to stream through the blinds, the shadows of their bars growing longer across the carpet. In the quiet of the office, the weight of everything that had been said hung in the air between them, waiting for what would come next. The clock ticked steadily, marking the moments of this turning point none of them would forget. The morning sun filtered through the high windows of Crestwood High's hallways, casting long shadows across the worn linoleum floors. Wallace's footsteps echoed unnaturally loud in the strange quiet that fell whenever he passed. His leather briefcase felt heavy in his hand, each step requiring more effort than it should. Groups of students lined the hallways, their conversations dropping to whispers as he approached. Some pulled out their phones, pretending to be occupied while stealing glances in his direction. Others simply stared openly, their eyes following him as he walked past. The weight of their gazes pressed against him like a physical force. Wallace kept his eyes forward, trying to maintain his composure, but his collar felt too tight. Sweat beaded at the back of his neck despite the cool morning air. The familiar hallway now felt alien and hostile, like walking through a museum where he was the main exhibit. A freshman girl quickly stepped aside as he approached, pressing herself against the lockers to avoid touching him. Her friends pulled her closer, their eyes hard and accusing. Wallace's stomach churned. He'd walked these halls for 15 years, but now he felt like an intruder. The whispers followed him like a wave. Can't believe he's still here. Did you see the video? How could they let him keep teaching? Each comment stung, but Wallace forced himself to keep walking. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his grip on his briefcase. The distance to his classroom seemed to stretch endlessly before him. 2 senior boys stood near the water fountain, their arms crossed as they watched him pass. Wallace recognized them from last year's English class. They had always laughed at his jokes, stayed after to discuss assignments. Now their faces were masks of disappointment and judgment. Finally, reaching his classroom, Wallace fumbled with his keys, the metal clinking loudly in the tense silence. He could feel eyes on his back as he opened the door, stepping into the familiar space that suddenly felt foreign. The empty desks seemed to accuse him, each one a reminder of students he might have hurt without realizing it. He set his briefcase down with shaking hands, the sound too loud in the quiet room. The morning light streamed through the windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Wallace moved to his desk, each step feeling uncertain, like walking on ice that might crack at any moment. Students began filtering in slowly, none making eye contact. They moved to their seats with unusual quiet, the normal morning chatter conspicuously absent. Some kept their heads down, while others watched him with wary expressions as if he might suddenly transform into something dangerous. Wallace stood at his desk trying to look normal, trying to appear like the teacher he was supposed to be. But his confidence had evaporated, leaving behind a hollow shell of uncertainty. He shuffled papers on his desk, more for something to do with his hands than any real purpose. The bell would ring soon. Wallace glanced at the clock, then at the door, his heart rate picking up. Would Jamal even come to class? After everything that had happened, would he transfer out? The thought made Wallace's stomach clench. He wouldn't blame Jamal if he did, but the idea filled him with a deep sadness he couldn't quite explain. More students filed in, the tension in the room building with each new arrival. The usual morning conversations were replaced with meaningful looks and subtle gestures. Wallace could feel them watching him, waiting to see what he would do, how he would act now that everyone knew the truth about him. Then Jamal appeared in the doorway. The room went completely still. Every head turned, every breath held. Wallace felt his heart skip a beat, his hands freezing mid-motion on his desk. Jamal stood there for a moment, his expression unreadable, his backpack slung over one shoulder. The silence stretched, heavy with anticipation. Students glanced between Jamal and Wallace, waiting for something to happen. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. But Jamal didn't make a scene. He didn't say anything at all. Instead, he simply walked to his desk, the same desk he'd always sat in, and took his seat. He pulled out his notebook and a pen, just like any other day, just like nothing had changed. The simple act seemed to break some sort of spell. Around the room, other students began to move again, pulling out their own supplies. The unusual silence gradually gave way to quiet murmurs, then to more normal levels of conversation. The atmosphere shifted not back to normal exactly, but to something less charged, less hostile. Wallace watched as Jamal opened his notebook to a fresh page, uncapped his pen, and wrote the date at the top. Each movement deliberate and ordinary. There was no anger in his actions, no defiance, just the routine motions of a student preparing for class. The message was clear, though unspoken. Jamal wasn't going to let the video or the drama or any of it change how he approached his education. He wasn't going to give Wallace the power to disrupt his learning anymore, either through cruelty or through absence. Other students seemed to take their cues from Jamal. The whispers died down. Books opened. Pens came out. The classroom gradually settled into its usual morning rhythm, though something delicate and uncertain still lingered in the air. Wallace felt his shoulders relax slightly, releasing a tension he hadn't realized he was holding. He wasn't forgiven. The stares and whispers in the hallway had made that clear. The video was still out there, his actions still exposed for everyone to see. The road ahead would be long and difficult. But he was still here, still standing at the front of his classroom, still given the chance to do better, to be better. He looked at the clock, 1 minute until the bell. Taking a deep breath, Wallace picked up his attendance sheet, the familiar motion steadying his hands. The afternoon sun streamed through the wide windows of Crestwood High's main hallway, casting a warm glow on the bulletin board outside the main office. Mr. Wallace walked slowly, his leather shoes clicking against the polished floor. The past month had felt like walking on eggshells, every day a careful balance between trying to prove he'd changed and accepting that some wounds take time to heal. He'd been making small gestures, offering encouragement instead of criticism, listening more than speaking. But he knew words alone couldn't erase what had happened. A cluster of students huddled around the bulletin board, their excited whispers bouncing off the walls. Wallace approached cautiously, maintaining a respectful distance. These days, he was always aware of how much space he took up, how his presence affected others. The carefree authority he once wielded had been replaced by something more tentative, more conscious. Through gaps between the students' shoulders, he caught glimpses of a fresh white paper with official letterhead. His eyes scanned down the list until they landed on a familiar name: Jamal Carter, state writing competition finalist. The words seemed to leap off the page. Something tightened in Wallace's chest, pride mixed with regret. He remembered that old essay he'd found, the one that had first opened his eyes to Jamal's talent. How many other brilliant pieces had he dismissed before that moment of revelation? How much potential had he nearly crushed with his assumptions and harsh judgments? The crowd of students shifted, and Wallace stepped back, not wanting to intrude on their excitement. That's when he saw Jamal approaching from the other end of the hallway, backpack slung over one shoulder, his usual composed expression in place. Even now, after everything, the boy carried himself with quiet dignity that Wallace couldn't help but admire. The students noticed him too. "Jamal," called out Sophie Chen, a junior with bright purple highlights in her hair. "Congratulations." Jamal nodded, a slight smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Other students joined in with their congratulations, creating a bubble of genuine warmth in the hallway. Wallace noticed how easily they celebrated him, how naturally they showed their support. "Your essay must have been amazing," said Marcus Thompson, another student. "What did you write about?" Wallace couldn't help but lean in slightly, curious himself. Jamal adjusted his backpack strap, his response measured and calm. "Systemic barriers in education," he said simply. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. A heavy silence fell over the group, and Wallace felt the weight of every pair of eyes that darted in his direction. The hallway suddenly seemed too bright, too exposed. Wallace didn't even think he was that good before, came a whispered comment from somewhere in the crowd. The words weren't meant for him, but they carried clearly in the quiet hallway, sharp as pins. Wallace's face burned, but he forced himself to stand still to accept the truth in those words. This was part of his penance, hearing his past actions echoed back to him, feeling their sting anew. He'd earned every uncomfortable moment. Jamal's expression didn't change, but his shoulders tensed slightly. He began to move away from the bulletin board, threading his way through the group of students who parted easily for him. Wallace knew he should say something. The old Wallace would have stayed silent, would have let his pride keep him mute. But he wasn't that person anymore, or at least he was trying not to be. Each day was a conscious decision to do better, to be better. "You deserve it," he said, his voice clear enough to carry down the hallway. Jamal paused mid-step. The hallway seemed to hold its breath. Students watched the exchange with undisguised interest, their heads swiveling between teacher and student like spectators at a tennis match. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, marking the seconds of silence. For a moment, Wallace thought Jamal might turn around, might say something. Instead, he simply nodded, a small but deliberate movement, and continued walking. His footsteps echoed in the now silent hallway as he disappeared around the corner. Wallace stood there watching the empty space where Jamal had been. The nod wasn't forgiveness. He knew that. It wasn't even acceptance, really, but it was acknowledgement, and maybe that was enough for now. Small steps, he reminded himself. Healing couldn't be rushed. The students began to disperse, their whispered conversations resuming as they drifted away from the bulletin board. Wallace remained, looking at Jamal's name on the list. The typed letters seemed to blur slightly as he remembered all the red marks he'd made on Jamal's papers, all the times he'd questioned the boy's abilities, all the moments he'd let his prejudices blind him to the brilliant mind right in front of him. The empty hallway felt both too large and too small. Wallace's reflection in the glass covering the bulletin board stared back at him, a man caught between who he was and who he wanted to be. The afternoon sun continued to stream through the windows, indifferent to the small dramas playing out beneath its warm light. But something had shifted, ever so slightly, and Wallace held on to that feeling like a promise. The grand conference hall of the downtown convention center buzzed with excitement. Hundreds of chairs, arranged in neat rows, filled quickly with proud parents, nervous students, and supportive teachers. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the crowd, their light reflecting off the polished wooden stage at the front of the room. The air hummed with anticipation, thick with perfume, aftershave, and the unmistakable electricity of achievement about to be recognized. Mr. Wallace slipped in through the back entrance, choosing a seat in the last row where shadows gathered. He tugged at his tie, feeling out of place in the formal setting. Part of him wondered if he should even be here, if his presence might somehow taint this moment for Jamal. But he had to come. He needed to see this. His palms were damp, and his collar felt too tight against his throat. Principal Carter sat prominently in the front row, his back straight and proud. Even from this distance, Wallace could see the slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Next to him sat an empty chair, Jamal's spot for when his part was done. The principal's dark suit was impeccable, his posture a statement of dignified expectation. The master of ceremonies approached the podium, tapping the microphone twice. The crowd's chatter died down to an expectant hush. After a brief introduction about the competition and its prestigious history, she began calling contestants to the stage. Each student received polite applause, but Wallace barely registered them, his mind fixed on a single name. Wallace's heart jumped when she announced, "And now presenting his piece, Silence Speaks, please welcome Jamal Carter from Crestwood High School." His mouth went dry, and he sat up straighter, eyes riveted to the stage. Jamal emerged from the wings wearing a crisp black suit that made him look older, more mature. His steps were measured and confident as he approached the podium. The stage lights caught his face, highlighting the quiet determination in his eyes. A look Wallace had seen so many times across his desk during those tense tutoring sessions. There was no trace of nervousness in his movements, just purpose. The room fell completely silent as Jamal adjusted the microphone. He didn't shuffle papers or fidget. He simply stood there, commanding attention without demanding it, a skill Wallace had never fully appreciated before. The moment stretched, pregnant with possibility. "When I was younger," Jamal began, his voice clear and strong, "my father taught me that words have power, but he also taught me that silence can be just as powerful." He paused, letting that sink in. "I've learned a lot about silence over the years." His words resonated through the hall, touching something deep in everyone present. Wallace felt his chest tighten. He gripped the armrests of his chair, remembering those wordless tutoring sessions, the weight of unspoken accusations hanging in the air between them. The memory was almost physical in its intensity. "Throughout my life, I've faced people who tried to define me, to put me in a box they thought I belonged in." Jamal's gaze swept across the audience. "I had a teacher once who thought he could break me." The words weren't accusatory, just matter of fact, which somehow made them more powerful. Wallace's breath caught in his throat. The air in the room seemed to still, as if everyone could sense the weight of what was coming next. His heart hammered against his ribs. "This teacher," Jamal continued, his voice steady, "saw what he wanted to see. He didn't see my straight A's or my previous awards. He saw what his own prejudices told him to see." There was no bitterness in his tone, just a calm statement of truth that cut deeper than any anger could have. Principal Carter's shoulders tensed slightly, but he remained still, listening intently to his son's words. His hands were folded neatly in his lap, his expression unreadable from Wallace's distant vantage point. "I almost believed him," Jamal admitted. "When someone in authority tells you day after day that you're not good enough, that you're troublesome, that you're less than, it starts to seep in, like water wearing away at stone." The vulnerability in his admission made several audience members shift uncomfortably in their seats. Wallace wanted to sink into his chair, to disappear completely, but he forced himself to stay, to bear witness to the truth of what he'd done. Each word was a mirror he couldn't look away from. "But I proved him wrong." Jamal's voice grew stronger. "And in doing so, he proved himself wrong too." The simple statement carried no triumph, just quiet acknowledgement. The words hung in the air like a bell tone. Wallace felt tears pricking at the corners of his eyes. He blinked rapidly, unwilling to miss a single moment of Jamal's speech. "Because here's what I learned about silence," Jamal continued. "Sometimes, when you refuse to let someone else's words define you, when you stand firm in your truth without fighting back, that silence becomes a mirror. And in that mirror, people might just see themselves clearly for the first time." His hands rested lightly on the podium, steady and sure. Principal Carter's head nodded slightly, pride evident in his posture. A small, knowing smile touched his lips. "This isn't just a story about proving someone wrong," Jamal said, his voice softening. "It's about what happens when people face their own reflections and choose to change. It's about the power we all have, not just to stand strong in the face of prejudice, but to grow beyond our own limitations." The wisdom in his young voice seemed to fill every corner of the vast hall. Wallace sat perfectly still, barely breathing. Each word felt like both an indictment and an acknowledgement, a complex truth that he was only now beginning to fully understand. His throat ached with emotion he couldn't express. "Change isn't easy," Jamal concluded. "It requires admitting we were wrong. It requires facing uncomfortable truths about ourselves. But it's possible. I've seen it happen." His final words carried both challenge and hope. The audience erupted in applause, many rising to their feet. Principal Carter was among the first to stand, his face beaming with pride. The sound filled the conference hall, echoing off the high ceiling and washing over Wallace in waves. Strangers turned to each other, nodding in appreciation, some wiping away tears. From his spot in the shadows, Wallace remained seated, letting Jamal's words sink deep into his soul. This wasn't forgiveness, not exactly. But it was something equally powerful. Recognition. Recognition of both the harm he had caused and the steps he had taken to change. His hands trembled slightly in his lap. The applause continued as Jamal took his seat next to his father, who squeezed his shoulder gently. Wallace watched them from afar, understanding that this moment wasn't about him. It was about Jamal, his strength, his dignity, and his wisdom in turning pain into something powerful. In that moment, teacher and student had exchanged roles in the most profound way possible. The school district office loomed before Wallace like a courthouse on Judgment Day. Its red brick exterior and tall windows seemed more imposing than ever as he climbed the concrete steps, his dress shoes clicking against each stair with a hollow sound that echoed his emptiness. His hands were steady, but his heart raced beneath his freshly pressed shirt and carefully chosen tie, a dark blue one he thought might convey sincerity. Inside the conference room, morning light streamed through tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished oak table where decisions about futures were made. 7 school board members sat in high-backed leather chairs, their expressions unreadable as they shuffled through papers and whispered among themselves, occasionally glancing up to study him. The room smelled of coffee and fresh printer ink. Someone had just copied yet another packet of complaints from concerned parents. A water pitcher sat untouched in the center, beads of condensation sliding down its sides. Wallace took his assigned seat, the chair slightly uncomfortable against his back, as if even the furniture was passing judgment. He'd prepared for this moment, rehearsed what he might say for hours in front of his bathroom mirror. But now all those practiced words felt hollow in his mind, like empty promises. Principal Carter sat off to the side, his presence neither supportive nor condemning, just watching, waiting with the patience of a man who knew justice would find its way. Board President Helen Martinez cleared her throat, adjusting her reading glasses with manicured fingers. "Mr. Wallace, I'm sure you understand why we're here today." Her voice was professional, neither kind nor cruel. The voice of someone who had conducted difficult meetings like this before. The video that has been circulating has caused significant concern among parents and students alike. Wallace nodded, his throat dry as sandpaper. "Yes, ma'am." Board member James Thompson, a retired principal himself with salt and pepper hair and decades of experience etched into the lines around his eyes, leaned forward. "We've received over 200 emails from parents demanding your immediate termination." He paused, letting those words sink in like stones dropping into still water. "The video shows you deliberately humiliating a student, a gifted student no less." "That's correct," Wallace admitted. The words tasted bitter in his mouth, like medicine he'd avoided taking for too long. Sarah Chen, another board member with a reputation for fairness, spoke up. "Your behavior in that video goes against everything we stand for as educators." She gestured to a stack of papers before her, at least 3 inches thick. "We have testimonials from other students claiming similar treatment, particularly towards minority students." Wallace felt his face grow hot with shame. Each word was like a knife, cutting away at the defensive walls he'd built over years of teaching. But he didn't argue or try to justify himself. He couldn't. Not anymore. The truth was too clear, too painful to deny. "The pressure to remove you is substantial," Martinez continued, her voice measured and calm. "Parents are threatening to go to the media. Some are discussing legal action." She paused, studying Wallace's face like she was trying to read something written there. "What do you have to say in your defense?" Wallace took a deep breath that seemed to fill his entire body. The rehearsed speeches evaporated from his mind like morning dew. Instead, he found himself speaking from somewhere deeper, somewhere more honest, a place he hadn't visited in years. "I won't defend what I did," he said quietly, his voice steady despite his inner turmoil. "I can't. I watched that video and I didn't recognize myself. Or maybe I did, and that's what scared me the most." He looked each board member in the eye, refusing to hide from their judgment. "I was wrong. Not just in that moment, but in my approach to teaching, in my treatment of students, in my prejudices." The room fell silent. Even the usual shuffle of papers ceased. Someone's watch ticked loudly in the stillness. "Pretty words," Thompson said, his tone skeptical, crossing his arms over his chest. "But how do we know this isn't just an act to save your job?" Wallace nodded, understanding the doubt. "You don't. I can't prove what's in my heart. All I can say is that this experience has changed me fundamentally as a teacher and as a person." Martinez studied him carefully, her eyes narrowing slightly. "The student in question, Jamal Carter. He's Principal Carter's son." She glanced at Carter, who remained stoic, hands folded in his lap. "Yet despite the video being leaked, despite the controversy, he hasn't called for your removal. Why do you think that is?" Wallace swallowed hard, feeling a lump in his throat. "Because Jamal is a better person than I was. He could have demanded my termination, but instead, he chose to teach me a lesson about power and humility." His voice grew quieter, almost a whisper. "He made me feel what he felt, and in doing so, he helped me see myself clearly for the first time." Board member Chen leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful, fingers tapping lightly on the table. "Do you believe you deserve to stay?" The question hung in the air like smoke after a fire. Wallace felt every eye in the room on him, waiting. His old self would have argued, would have listed his accomplishments, his years of service, his dedication to the school. But that wasn't who he was anymore. That man had been exposed and found wanting. "I don't know if I deserve it," he admitted, his voice steady despite the trembling in his chest. "But I know I'm not the same man I was." The silence that followed felt eternal. Board members exchanged glances, some nodding slightly, others frowning in thought. A clock on the wall ticked loudly, marking seconds that felt like hours. Wallace sat still, his hands folded on his lap, accepting whatever judgment would come. He'd spent his career wielding power over students. Now he understood what it felt like to be powerless, to have your future in someone else's hands. Principal Carter, who had remained silent throughout the proceedings, suddenly leaned forward in his chair, the movement deliberate and measured. All eyes turned to him as he cleared his throat, the sound cutting through the tension like a knife. "I think he's earned one more chance." The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the classroom windows, painting golden stripes across empty desks. Mr. Wallace sat at his desk, fingers drumming an uneven rhythm on its worn surface. His briefcase lay open, revealing a single essay on top, Jamal's latest work, marked with a bright red 100% at the top. The clock's steady ticking filled the quiet room. Wallace straightened the essay for the 5th time, making sure it aligned perfectly with the edge of his desk. His tie felt too tight, though he'd loosened it twice already. The board's decision to keep him on still felt surreal, like a dream he might wake up from at any moment. He ran his thumb over the corner of Jamal's paper, remembering the heated words exchanged during that final hearing, the shame that had burned his face as his own prejudices were laid bare. A shadow passed by the doorway, and Wallace's hands stilled. Jamal appeared in the entrance, backpack slung over one shoulder. Something was different today. The usual rigid set of his shoulders was gone, replaced by a more natural posture. His face, typically masked in careful neutrality, showed hints of not quite warmth, but perhaps acceptance. The wariness that had shadowed his eyes for months seemed lighter somehow. "Good afternoon," Wallace said, his voice softer than it used to be. Gone was the sharp edge that had once cut through this room like a blade. He cleared his throat, fighting the urge to fill the silence with unnecessary words. Jamal nodded as he took his usual seat. "Afternoon." The word wasn't exactly friendly, but it wasn't cold either. It just was. He set his backpack down with the same careful precision he applied to everything. Wallace watched as Jamal pulled out his notebooks with practiced efficiency. The familiar routine felt different now, stripped of its previous tension. The air in the room was lighter, though still careful, like a winter morning when the ice has begun to thaw but hasn't quite melted. Sunlight caught the dust motes floating between them, tiny particles suspended in the fragile piece they'd constructed. "I have your essay," Wallace said, picking up the paper. He held it for a moment, remembering how he used to wield such papers like weapons, searching for every minor flaw, every excuse to prove his prejudiced assumptions right. Now the paper felt different in his hands, not a tool for punishment, but a testament to excellence. The weight of his past behavior pressed on his shoulders. He extended the essay toward Jamal, the red 100% clearly visible at the top. No red marks marred the pages, no cutting comments lined the margins. Just a perfect score for perfect work, the kind of recognition that should have been Jamal's all along. Jamal took the paper, his eyes finding the grade immediately. His expression remained unreadable, but something flickered in his eyes, perhaps surprise, perhaps vindication. He studied the unmarked pages, turning them slowly, as if expecting to find the usual criticism hidden somewhere. His fingertips traced the clean margins where harsh comments once lived. Wallace watched, fighting the urge to fill the silence with explanations or justifications. He'd done enough talking over the months. Now was time for listening, even to silence. He folded his hands on the desk to keep from fidgeting, a habit he'd only recently noticed about himself. The classroom's quiet was broken only by the soft rustle of paper as Jamal carefully placed the essay in his folder. His movements were deliberate, measured, just like everything else about him. Wallace had once mistaken that careful control for defiance. Now he recognized it for what it was: dignity, the kind of inner strength that couldn't be taught in any classroom. Sunlight shifted through the windows, the afternoon growing later. This was their last official tutoring session, a requirement that had outlived its purpose weeks ago. They both knew Jamal had never needed tutoring in the first place. The charade had served its purpose, forcing them into this shared space where understanding could slowly take root. Jamal began packing his things, each item finding its precise place in his backpack. The familiar sound of zippers and rustling paper filled the room. Wallace watched, aware that this moment marked not an ending, but a transition. The power dynamic that had defined their relationship was finally, truly dissolving. As Jamal stood, shouldering his backpack, Wallace felt words rising in his throat. Not the sharp commands or cutting remarks of before, but something entirely different. Something that had taken months of self-reflection to understand, let alone express. His heart hammered against his ribs. "Thank you," Wallace said, the words coming out quiet but clear. Jamal paused, his hand on the strap of his backpack. His eyes met Wallace's, and in that moment, volumes passed between them without a word being spoken. Then, with a slight nod, not dismissive, not cold, but acknowledging, Jamal turned and walked out of the classroom. Wallace remained seated, watching the empty doorway. The afternoon sun continued its slow march across the room, and the clock kept its steady rhythm. But something had shifted, settled, like dust finally finding its place after a long storm. He exhaled slowly, feeling lighter than he had in months. The classroom felt different now. The space that had once been filled with tension and unspoken battles now held something else, not quite peace, not quite forgiveness, but perhaps understanding. The silence that remained wasn't heavy with unsaid words or suppressed anger. It was simply quiet, like the calm after rain. A gentle stillness that spoke of possibilities. Wallace sat there, letting the moment sink in. That simple thank you had carried more weight than any lengthy speech could have. And Jamal's nod, slight as it was, had acknowledged not just the words, but the change they represented. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, maybe not ever, but it was acceptance of the change, of the effort, of the possibility that people could learn and grow, that people like him could do better. The golden afternoon light continued to paint stripes across the empty desks, touching the spot where Jamal had sat just moments before. Wallace remained still, aware that this moment marked something significant. Not an end, but a beginning. A new chapter where both teacher and student had learned lessons far beyond any curriculum. He smiled faintly, grateful for second chances he hadn't deserved, but was determined to honor. The school auditorium buzzed with excitement, packed with proud families clutching bouquets and balloons. Afternoon sunlight streamed through the high windows, catching the gold tassels that swayed from countless graduation caps. Mr. Wallace sat in the last row, hands folded in his lap, trying to make himself invisible among the crowd of chattering parents and siblings. From his position, he could see the neat rows of graduating seniors in their royal blue caps and gowns. His eyes found Jamal easily. The young man sat straight-backed in the front row, his posture perfect as always. Principal Carter stood at the podium, his voice carrying through the packed room with quiet authority as he welcomed everyone to the ceremony. Wallace felt a familiar tightness in his chest as he watched. He didn't really belong here, he knew that. But something had drawn him anyway, some need to see this moment through. His fingers twisted together in his lap as the ceremony began, names being called one by one. The graduates walked across the stage in alphabetical order. Wallace sat straighter when they reached the C's, his breath catching slightly as Principal Carter's voice rang out clear and strong. Jamal Carter. Jamal rose smoothly from his seat, walking with measured steps toward the stage. His movements were graceful, unhurried, carrying the same quiet dignity he'd shown throughout the year. As he climbed the steps, Wallace could see his face in profile, calm, composed, but with the hint of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Principal Carter's face glowed with pride as his son approached. Their handshake wasn't just ceremonial. There was real warmth there, real connection. The principal held out the diploma with his right hand while his left clasped Jamal's shoulder, a gesture both professional and deeply personal. Though Wallace couldn't hear their exchange from his position, he could see the way Jamal's smile widened, genuine and bright. The moment stretched, father and son sharing this milestone, before Jamal moved on to complete his walk across the stage. Wallace found himself holding his breath, watching as this young man he'd once tried so hard to break down stood tall and triumphant. The sight stirred something deep in his chest, pride mixed with lingering shame, hope tangled with regret. After the ceremony ended and the caps had been tossed into the air, the auditorium erupted into controlled chaos. Families surged forward to find their graduates, hugs and tears flowing freely. Wallace remained in his seat, watching from a distance as Jamal was surrounded by well-wishers. Principal Carter wrapped his son in a fierce hug, and Wallace could see several teachers stopping by to offer their congratulations. He should leave, Wallace knew. This wasn't his moment to intrude upon, but his feet seemed rooted to the floor, unable or unwilling to carry him away just yet. So he sat, a quiet observer on the periphery of the celebration, watching as Jamal accepted congratulations with gracious nods and quiet thank yous. The crowd began to thin gradually, families drifting away to private celebrations. Wallace still hadn't moved, though he'd loosened his tie slightly in the warm air. He noticed the exact moment Jamal spotted him, saw the slight pause in the young man's movements, the way his eyes fixed on Wallace's position in the back row. Wallace held his breath, unsure what to expect. He wouldn't have blamed Jamal for ignoring him completely. Their relationship had shifted over the past months, the raw antagonism fading into something more complex, but they were far from friends. The best Wallace could hope for was that they'd reached a kind of peace. Jamal said something to his father, then began making his way through the scattered groups of people still milling about. His path was indirect, but deliberate, moving steadily closer to where Wallace sat. Each step seemed to take an eternity, the distance between them shrinking with gradual inevitability. Finally, Jamal stood before him, still in his graduation robes, tassel swaying slightly with his movement. Up close, Wallace could see the subtle signs of emotion in his face. Not quite a smile, but something softer than his usual careful mask. They looked at each other in silence for a long moment, the noise of the remaining crowd fading into background murmur. "Thank you," Jamal said simply, his voice carrying the same quiet strength it always had. Before Wallace could form a response, could find words to express any of the complicated emotions churning in his chest, Jamal had turned away. Wallace watched him walk back through the thinning crowd, his blue graduation gown swaying slightly with each step, moving steadily toward the door and whatever waited beyond it. If you enjoyed the story of Jamal, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it, whatever waited beyond it. If you enjoyed the story of Jamal, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it,